and Keanu Reeves just wanted a quiet steak with an old friend, until a trembling waitress leaned in and whispered, "They said you shouldn't be here tonight." What happened next turned a simple dinner into a showdown that would change an entire town. And it all started with 6 chilling words she was too afraid to say out loud. Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The parking lot was nearly full, gravel crunching under Keanu's boots as he stepped out of his pickup truck. The building hadn't changed in over a decade. Same crooked sign over the door, same humming neon beer light in the front window. Oaks and iron didn't look like much from the outside, just a weathered wooden roadhouse tucked off a quiet Northern California highway. But to Keanu, it was one of the last places where he could just be a man, not a name. He walked slowly toward the entrance, cap pulled low over his brow, sunglasses tucked in his shirt collar, boots worn but clean. A breeze moved through the oak trees lining the edge of the lot, rustling the leaves in quiet rhythm. For a moment it felt like peace, just one quiet Friday night, a chance to eat a decent meal and sit alone with his thoughts. Inside, the atmosphere was relaxed. The smell of grilled steak and peppercorn lingered heavy in the air. Laughter bubbled from a table near the back, and the low hum of conversation floated through the wood-paneled walls. It was the kind of place where locals came every week and didn't need menus. Comfortable, casual, unpretentious. But as Keanu stepped through the door, the energy shifted. Not sharply, not like a crash, just a subtle pause. The kind of silence that slipped in unnoticed, like a breath held too long. An older couple at the bar turned slowly, eyes widening. A teenage busboy nearly dropped a tray of silverware. 2 men in flannel paused mid-conversation, one nudging the other subtly with his elbow. Across the room, a woman whispered something to her daughter, and the girl spun in her seat to get a better look. Keanu didn't smile, but he nodded politely, acknowledging the attention without inviting more. He wasn't trying to be seen tonight. He just wanted something familiar. And in a world where everything seemed louder than it used to, oaks and iron still felt steady. He moved toward the back of the room and took his old seat by the window. The corner booth with the worn leather cushion and view of the lot. From there, he could see who came in and who went out. He hadn't sat in this spot in years, but his body remembered it. That unshakable stillness he carried from long days on set or long nights on motorcycles settled naturally into the corner of the booth. He removed his cap, set it gently on the table, and glanced out toward the empty field behind the building. Just steak and quiet. That's all tonight was supposed to be. The sound of hesitant footsteps brought Keanu's attention back to the table. A young waitress approached, shoulders stiff, gripping a notepad like it might slip through her fingers if she let her guard down. Her dark hair was pulled into a tight ponytail, but a few strands had broken loose, curling at the edges of her flushed cheeks. Her name tag read, Rena, tilted slightly to one side, barely hanging on. She looked young, early 20s maybe, and far too anxious for someone delivering iced tea and dinner orders. Her eyes widened slightly when she realized who she was walking up to. She opened her mouth, closed it again, then took a quick breath and forced a small smile. "Evening, sir," she said, voice light but shaky. Keanu looked up at her with that quiet warmth he was known for, the kind that put people at ease without effort. "Hi," he replied softly. "Don't worry, I'll keep it simple." Rena nodded quickly, as if grateful for that mercy. She clicked her pen, poised over her pad, and asked, "What can I get started for you?" "I'll go with the usual," Keanu said, his tone calm. She blinked. I don't actually know what that is." He chuckled gently, a low, sincere sound that broke the tension between them. "Ribeye, medium rare, fries. Collard greens if you've got them. Iced tea. No lemon, just 2 sugars." Rena scribbled quickly, her hands trembling just enough that the pen scratched audibly against the paper. In her rush, she dropped the pad and it slid across the table before slipping underneath. "Oh no, sorry," she said, crouching to retrieve it. Her head bumped the underside of the table with a dull thud. Keanu instinctively leaned forward, steadying her shoulder as she tried to rise again. "You okay?" he asked, gently. "I'm fine," she mumbled, embarrassed. Her cheeks flushed bright pink. I didn't expect... Sorry, I'm just a little nervous." "It's all good," Keanu replied with a soft smile. "Really? It's just dinner." She let out a short, breathy laugh and nodded, backing away with her notepad clutched to her chest. "Right, just dinner. I'll get that started." He gave her a small nod of reassurance, and she turned to walk away. But halfway to the kitchen, her steps slowed, her posture changed. She wasn't moving like someone who had simply taken an order. Her shoulders hunched, her head tilted slightly toward the back of the room. Then she stopped altogether, frozen, as if something or someone had spoken without making a sound. Her spine stiffened. She stood there for a second too long, just staring straight ahead. And then, slowly, she turned back toward Keanu's table. Her face had changed. The polite nervousness was gone. Something heavier had taken its place. Something she wasn't sure she should say out loud. Rena's steps were slower this time as she approached the booth again, each footfall deliberate, hesitant. She kept glancing over her shoulder, toward the corner of the restaurant where the lights didn't quite reach, where shadows curled around a booth full of men who hadn't taken their eyes off Keanu since he walked in. She stopped beside the table and leaned in slightly, close enough that her voice wouldn't carry. "Can I ask you something?" she whispered. Keanu looked up, sensing the shift in her tone. "Of course. How long are you planning on staying tonight?" He raised an eyebrow, not rudely, just puzzled. "Long enough to finish dinner. Why?" Rena's eyes darted toward the shadowy booth again. One of the men, broad-shouldered, shaved head, tattoo snaking down his neck, smirked when their eyes met. Another man tilted his beer glass lazily in Keanu's direction, like it was some kind of taunt. Rena's voice dropped even lower, almost breathless. "They don't want you here tonight." Keanu didn't flinch, didn't blink. His body remained still, but something changed in his expression. A quiet, focused calm that settled behind his eyes. Not fear, not even anger, just readiness. "That's so," he said quietly. Rena gave a small nod, her lips barely moving. He followed her glance and saw the man in the middle of the group, watching him without a trace of subtlety. Blonde hair buzzed short, sharp jawline, expression dripping with smugness. He was the kind of man who didn't need to shout to own a room. He made other people lower their voices. Keanu had seen men like him before. Different faces, same stare. "I just thought you should know," Rena said, "before your food comes out." He nodded once, acknowledging the weight behind her words. "Thank you." Before she could say more, the sound of the front door opening broke the moment. A tall figure stepped into the restaurant, moving with the slow confidence of someone who had walked into too many tense rooms before. Broad shoulders, black shirt, gray hair pulled back. Steven Seagal. The chatter in the room faltered again. Not out of recognition, though some did recognize him, but because something in the air shifted when he walked in, like a storm front moving in without a word. Steven scanned the room. His eyes landed on Keanu and he smiled. Keanu stood up from the booth for the first time that evening. His face cracked into something real, a grin full of history. "Thought I'd surprise you," Steven said, making his way over. Keanu laughed quietly and replied, "Well, you did." The two embraced like old friends and the room leaned in without meaning to. What began as just another quiet Friday had taken its first step into something else entirely. Something no one in Oaks and Iron was ready for. The hush that followed Steven's entrance lasted just long enough for everyone to register what they were seeing. Keanu Reeves and Steven Seagal in the same room, in the same small-town steakhouse, at the same table. Steven sat down across from Keanu, stretching his shoulders like a man who'd carried too much weight for too many years. Keanu slid his cap back onto the table, his expression lightening a little. He hadn't seen Steven in nearly a year, not since that charity event in Arizona where they'd shaken hands in a crowded ballroom and promised to grab dinner soon. Apparently, tonight was soon. "Figured I'd find you here," Steven said, lowering his voice as he scanned the room. "Didn't figure you'd show up without warning," Keanu replied, his grin half hidden behind his tea glass. Steven glanced toward the back booth, where 4 men had gone completely silent. He didn't speak about them yet, but his eyes lingered, noting posture, attitude, and the subtle shift of weight in one man's shoulders. Then Rena returned. She stepped lightly, but her smile was tighter now. Not nervous this time. Worried. She set down Keanu's drink and Steven's water, hands steady but knuckles pale with pressure. She hesitated. Keanu caught it right away. "You all right?" She gave a little nod, eyes flicking toward the back corner again. "Can I ask how long you're planning to stay tonight?" she whispered, keeping her face composed. Keanu leaned in slightly, puzzled. "Why? I just got here." Rena didn't answer immediately. She looked over her shoulder. The men in the corner were still watching. One of them, the bald one with the scar running across his chin, smirked openly and cracked his knuckles. Slow and loud enough to echo faintly through the room. "They don't want you here," she murmured, "especially not tonight." Keanu didn't flinch. He followed her gaze, locking eyes with the man in the middle of the group. Blonde, clean-shaven, designer shirt open at the collar. Everything about him screamed money and menace. Dominic Crane. Keanu didn't know his name yet, but he knew the type. He'd met versions of Dominic all his life, on sets, in back rooms, in real-life confrontations disguised as business meetings. The kind of man who confused silence for permission and money for power. Dominic didn't break eye contact. His lip curled into a smile that wasn't friendly. Keanu looked back at Rena. "Thank you for telling me." Her voice dropped even lower. "Just watch your back." Steven leaned forward, voice calm but grounded. "I take it that booth in the shadows isn't part of the Friday night special?" Rena looked at him, surprised he'd picked up on it so fast. "They've been here every week lately, always watching, always making folks uncomfortable." Keanu kept his tone even. "You know who they are? Contractors, or something like that. Dominic runs a company that does high-end builds, ranches, wineries, private homes. His money's clean enough to stay out of trouble, but everyone around here knows he's the reason people have started leaving early." Steven asked without blinking. "And nobody says anything?" Rena shook her head slightly. "Not out loud. His crew tips well, he buys drinks, he calls the owner's son by his first name. Folks around here pretend not to see what's happening because it's easier than getting involved." Keanu's eyes returned to the booth. Dominic still hadn't looked away. Steven sighed, the kind of sigh that carried more weight than words. Funny how people with the loudest bark usually go quiet when someone finally barks back. Rena looked between them. "You two, you're not just going to sit here and eat, are you?" Keanu offered a small smile. "That was the plan. We'll see how the night goes." Before Rena could respond, Dominic leaned over and whispered something to the man on his right. The man laughed, loud, on purpose. Rena took a step back from the table. "I should go check on the kitchen," she said quickly. "Let me know if you need anything else." Keanu gave her a nod. She walked away quickly, but not before glancing once more at Dominic's booth. Her fingers fidgeted at her side like she was trying to keep herself from visibly shaking. Steven reached for his glass, took a sip of water, then muttered, "That kid's scared." She should be, Keanu said. But she still came back to warn me. Steven nodded slowly. That tells you everything. Dominic suddenly stood up, stretched with a theatrical groan, and swaggered toward the bar like he owned it. One of his men trailed behind. The other two stayed seated, watching Steven and Keanu with idle interest, like lions in tall grass. Keanu didn't turn to follow Dominic's path. Instead, he reached for the sugar on the table and stirred his tea. Steven raised an eyebrow. You always this calm when people make threats over steak? Keanu's reply was simple. Only when I know they're not the ones in control. Steven grinned, leaning back against the booth. You haven't changed. Keanu took another sip of tea and set the glass down with quiet precision. Neither have you. Across the room, Dominic finished ordering and turned just enough to make eye contact again. His smile was wider now, like he was waiting for something. So was Keanu. As Dominic made his way back to the corner booth, he stopped briefly by the jukebox. He didn't touch it, just hovered, like he was waiting for the room to look his way again. When no one did, he glanced toward Keanu and Steven one more time, then finally returned to his seat. Steven tapped the side of his glass. You know, I've walked into a lot of bad situations in my time, but this one's got its own smell. Keanu leaned forward slightly, his voice low. Yeah, feels like something's been building here for a while. Steven nodded. Like a pressure cooker that nobody's opened. The food hadn't arrived yet, but neither of them seemed to notice. Rena hadn't come back to the table. The other waitstaff kept their distance, as if silently instructed not to get too involved. Keanu's gaze drifted back toward the window. The moonlight stretched across the parking lot in pale ribbons, broken only by the occasional passing car on the nearby highway. Steven cracked his knuckles absently. She asked if we were just going to sit here and eat. I remember, Keanu said. And we're not, are we? Keanu looked at him, quiet and steady. No, we're not. A sudden movement made them both glance up. Rena had returned, but not alone. Blake, the owner's son, was shadowing her, pretending to refill a ketchup bottle from the next table. He glanced over, then away, clearly uncomfortable. Rena approached slowly, two plates balanced carefully on her tray. Her steps were more measured now, controlled, but her eyes still carried that tension, like she was walking through a minefield. As she set the steaks down in front of them, she whispered under her breath. He's watching everything. I think he knows I said something. Keanu looked up at her, voice steady. You told the truth. That's not something to be afraid of. She hesitated. I don't know if that's true in this place. Steven glanced toward the kitchen, then back to her. What's his name? She paused, swallowing hard. Dominic Crane. The name lingered in the air for a beat too long. Keanu nodded once, slow and deliberate. Got it. Rena set the last glass of tea down, adjusted the plate and stepped back. Her voice was softer now. Be careful. She turned to go, but halfway back to the kitchen, she looked over her shoulder again. And this time, it wasn't just fear in her eyes. It was the quiet desperation of someone who'd been hoping. Just maybe, this time, someone would actually stay. Keanu's fork moved slowly through the edge of his steak, cutting cleanly but without hurry. Steven was already a few bites in, chewing with that kind of ease that came from decades of knowing how to stay aware, even while eating. Their conversation started light, the way it often did between two men who didn't need to prove anything to each other. They talked about a project Steven was helping produce for an indie filmmaker, something small, something honest. Keanu listened, nodding along, asking thoughtful questions. He mentioned a recent trip to a veterans shelter in Texas, where he'd spent the afternoon serving food and talking with men who had nothing but stories left. It grounded him. Steven leaned back, sipping his tea. Places like this, he said, motioning toward the low ceilings and old wooden beams. They're disappearing. Keanu nodded slowly. That's what makes them matter more. Just then, Rena returned with a small tray, refilling their drinks. Her hands shook, just enough that Steven noticed. Keanu gently placed his hand on the edge of her tray to steady it. "You okay?" She glanced toward the back of the room and gave a practiced smile. "Fine, just trying to keep up." Keanu tilted his head. "Sit for a minute." She blinked. "What?" "Sit," he said again, softer this time. "Please?" Her eyes flicked toward the corner booth, then back to Keanu. "If they see me talking too long with you..." Steven spoke without looking up. "They already know." Rena hesitated. The tray trembled just slightly in her grip. Then she let out a slow breath and carefully pulled the chair across from Keanu. She sat down without speaking, hands folded tightly in her lap. Keanu gave her time. No pressure, no urgency. The silence was comforting in its own way, a space where she didn't have to rush. Then, slowly, her voice cracked the quiet. "They started coming about 4 months ago. Dominic Crane and his crew. Contractors, they say, but they come in dressed like CEOs. Button-downs, Rolexes, talk loud, tip big. But everything about them feels wrong." Steven leaned in slightly, listening without interrupting. Patients eagerly harass customers, whisper things at women walking by, laugh when people get uncomfortable, they stare too long, make jokes too loud, and they always sit in that same booth, like they own it. She looked down at the table. Her voice was quiet, but every word was sharp. They scared off a couple last month, just looked at them and smirked, until the couple couldn't even finish their food. Blake pretends not to see. He doesn't want trouble. Keanu asked gently, "What about the owner?" Her eyes shifted. "Blake's dad, Jerry, he tried to say something once. Told Dominic they weren't welcome if they couldn't respect the space. Dominic smiled, offered to buy the place. A week later, Jerry fell in the kitchen, cracked 2 ribs. Steven's jaw tensed. Fell? Rena didn't answer. She didn't have to. Rena's voice softened as she continued. After Jerry got hurt, he stopped coming in. Blake took over most of the shifts. But he's not his father. Blake, he's scared. I don't blame him. They tip heavy, and they bring in other men, guys who look rougher every time. And every time they walk through that door, the whole place changes." Keanu nodded slowly. "Has anyone gone to the police?" She shook her head. "And say what? That some men are making people uncomfortable? No one's filming it. No one's screaming. They smile while they do it. It's always just subtle enough to be deniable." Steven folded his arms across his chest, but not harmless. Rena looked at him, eyes tired. "Last week, there was a man, probably in his 70s. He came in wearing a navy blue jacket with a patch, said USS Hornet, walked with a limp, came alone, sat by the bar." Keanu listened, face unreadable. "They surrounded him near the bathroom. I saw it happen. I heard one of them say, 'Wrong uniform for this neighborhood.' Then they told him he didn't belong here. They didn't even yell, just surrounded him with their bodies until he couldn't breathe. He left his plate half full." Her hands tightened in her lap. "I tried to stop them. I really did. I went to Blake and said we couldn't let them keep doing this, and he just said, 'Let it go, Rena. It's not our fight.'" Steven shook his head. "That's what people always say. Until it is." Rena's eyes welled. "I didn't say anything to the old man. I should have followed him out. I should have said I was sorry." Keanu leaned forward, his voice calm but heavy. "You're saying something now." She hesitated again, and when she spoke next, her voice dropped to a whisper. "Dominic, he and I went to the same high school." Steven raised an eyebrow. "Seriously?" She nodded. "He was older, bigger. He used to corner me in the halls, lock me in janitors' closets, spread rumors, told people I was trouble. Everyone knew, teachers, coaches, but his family had money. His father donated a building to the school, so nothing ever stuck." Her hands were trembling now, her shoulders drawn tight. Now he walks into this place like he owns it. And people let him. Because they remember who his father was. Because they think it's easier to just survive him. Keanu looked directly at her, eyes steady. But you didn't survive him. You faced him. You told the truth. Rena blinked. A tear slipped down her cheek. She didn't brush it away. You just did something most people wouldn't, he said. That matters. Steven's voice was lower now, calm but resolute. Takes guts to speak up when someone like him's been shadowing your life for that long. Rena sniffed quietly. It doesn't feel brave. It just feels risky. Keanu tilted his head. They're the same thing sometimes. She gave a weak nod and started to rise, but Steven gestured for her to sit a moment longer. You said Dominic owns a contracting company? Crane Design Build, she replied. They do the high-end stuff, pools, decks, expansions. Half the town's been on his payroll at some point. He throws money around like bandages, keeps people loyal. Or afraid. Keanu leaned back slightly. And the crew with him tonight? His regulars, she said. That's Luke. He's the one with the shaved head. The guy with the smug look is TJ. He laughs at everything Dominic says, even when it's cruel. The quiet one with the tattoo on his hand is Mason. Don't be fooled. He's the worst. Last month, someone tried to record them hassling a family, and Mason smashed the phone before they even got past the camera app. Steven narrowed his eyes. You're saying this isn't just intimidation, it's control? Rena nodded. Dominic learned that a long time ago. He doesn't need fists to own people. Just fear and familiarity. Keanu looked toward the window. The night outside looked calm, but calm never told the whole story. What about Travis? Steven asked. Blake's cousin, right? Yeah, Rena said. He works the bar sometimes. He knows what's going on. But he doesn't want to lose Dominic's business either. The guy drinks top shelf, tips 20s like candy, and makes a big show of supporting local places. It's all performative, all for power. Keanu's hands rested on the table, still and thoughtful. Rena wiped her cheeks. I wasn't even supposed to work tonight. I picked up this shift for a friend who got sick. If she hadn't called me, I wouldn't have seen you. I wouldn't have had the nerve to say anything. Steven looked at her and said softly, You were meant to be here. She met his gaze. There was no doubt in his tone, no performance, just quiet truth. Rena, Keanu said, his voice gentle. It's not your job to fight them alone. But it is your story. And now that you've told it, we're here with you. A silence settled between them. But it wasn't heavy. It was the kind of silence that comes right before something important begins. She stood slowly, steadier than before. I should check the kitchen. Keanu nodded. We'll be here. Rena glanced toward the back booth again, but her shoulders didn't shrink this time. And as she walked away, it was clear. She wasn't just serving tables anymore. She was drawing a line. The tension in the room had thickened, not with shouting or spectacle, but with something quieter and far more dangerous. Whispers had stopped. Forks paused midair. Conversations thinned into silence. Dominic Crane stood up from his booth in the corner. His stride was slow, deliberate, a swagger disguised as a stroll. His sleeves were rolled neatly to the elbows, revealing a silver watch that flashed under the restaurant lights every time he moved his hand. The other three men at his table didn't move. They just watched. Keanu saw Dominic coming without looking directly at him. He continued eating, unbothered. Steven sat with arms folded, leaning against the booth like a man on a porch, watching a storm roll in. Dominic stopped at their table. He didn't speak at first, just stood there, smirking like a man who already thought he'd won something. Then he raised his voice loud enough for half the restaurant to hear. Well, Keanu Reeves and Steven Seagal. Didn't expect to see the big screen showing up in a place like this. You boys lost, or are you just slumming it for old time's sake? Steven glanced at him, not moving. Keanu slowly set down his fork and looked up, expression neutral. Dominic kept going. Gotta say, I grew up watching you guys. All those bad guys you beat up, all the justice you dished out. Good stuff. Real inspiring. He chuckled under his breath, but there was no humor in it. Of course, he added, that was just pretend, right? Keanu didn't respond. Dominic stepped closer. Out here, this ain't a movie set. Out here, the rules are real, and people like me, we make them. Steven's gaze sharpened. Do you always walk up to strangers and talk this much? Dominic smirked wider. Just trying to say welcome. Thought maybe someone ought to let you know how things work around here. He reached out suddenly, fingers brushing toward Steven's tied-back hair like he was petting a dog. The movement was fast. Too fast. Steven's hand snapped up, locked around Dominic's wrist and twisted just enough to make the bones shift. Dominic froze, teeth clenching, the smirk bleeding off his face like color draining from a canvas. Steven didn't raise his voice. Touch me again, and we'll find out what's real. Dominic's mouth twitched as he tried to mask the pain. Easy, old man. No need to get theatrical. Keanu's voice came next. Calm, precise. You might still be here tomorrow, he said, but after tonight, you won't be invisible anymore. Dominic's eyes darted between them, trying to measure the room. For the first time, his grin didn't feel in control. He yanked his wrist back from Steven's grip, rubbing it with his other hand as he stepped away. You boys enjoy your meal, he said, backing up a step. But watch your backs. He turned and walked off. But the whole room had heard him, and no one laughed. As Dominic made his way back to his booth, the hum of the restaurant returned, but not the way it was before. Conversations resumed, but softer. Laughter returned, but it felt forced. Everyone had seen it, everyone had heard it, and now no one could pretend the evening was just another night out. At the bar, a man in his 60s quietly slid his drink away and asked for the check. A couple seated near the window exchanged a tense look. Even the kitchen door, swinging back and forth behind a passing server, seemed slower, like the whole place was holding its breath. Steven leaned back, shaking out his hand once before picking up his glass. You feel that shift? He muttered. Keanu nodded. The room's been living under his shadow for a long time. They just saw it flicker. Rena returned a few minutes later, not with a tray this time, just a refill pitcher and 2 tight lips. Her posture was straighter, but her eyes kept scanning the back of the room. She poured the iced tea quietly, her hands a little steadier now. I saw what happened. Keanu looked at her gently. You okay? She nodded. I don't know if it's relief or fear, but I guess I've lived with both for a while. Steven tapped his spoon against the rim of his glass. You've lived with silence. That's worse. Rena blinked, then looked at the 2 men sitting in front of her. Something about their stillness, how unshaken they were, seemed to settle her nerves more than anything else. He's not used to people looking him in the eye, she said quietly. Let alone stopping his hand mid-air. Is used to control, Keanu added. The kind people hand over without realizing it? She stood there a moment longer. Then, almost as an afterthought, she said, Blake saw it too. He didn't say anything, but he saw. Steven glanced toward the kitchen. He'll have to choose soon. Can't run 2 sides of the line forever. Rena straightened. I should get back, but thank you. Keanu gave her a soft nod. She walked away, and this time, she didn't look back at Dominic's booth. Across the room, Dominic's men had leaned in close, murmuring. Dominic wasn't speaking. He was watching. One hand resting on the table, the other clenched beneath it, his jaw tight enough to crack stone. Steven leaned forward slightly, keeping his voice low. You think he's going to escalate? Keanu didn't answer right away. He finished the bite on his fork, chewed thoughtfully, and set it down beside his plate. Then he said, Men like that don't like being seen, and tonight He was. Steven nodded. Then it's just a matter of time, Keanu replied. Yeah. And we'll be ready when he tries. Dominic sat rigidly in his booth, arms folded across his chest, his fingers tapping rhythmically against the table. His men glanced at him for direction, unsure if they should laugh off what had just happened or prepare for something worse. But Dominic didn't speak. His focus never left the corner booth. The balance had shifted. Keanu picked up his tea again, drank slowly, and let silence be his answer to the threat. Steven relaxed his shoulders just slightly, but his eyes still moved, watching the room, the door, the edges of every possible exit and entry. Their plates were half finished now, but neither seemed in a hurry to clean them. It wasn't about the food anymore. It hadn't been since the moment Rena whispered that warning. Steven tilted his head toward Keanu. You remember Berlin? That producer who brought a gun to the table because we rewrote his ending? Keanu gave a dry smile. Yeah, he cried in the bathroom 20 minutes later. Steven nodded. Dominic's got the same energy. Tough until something stares back. Keanu glanced across the room again. Dominic was still watching, still trying to reclaim something he'd lost the moment Steven twisted his wrist. Then Steven added, voice low, he's going to come again, but next time, he won't talk first. Keanu didn't flinch. He'll make that mistake too. Rena returned with the check, but she didn't speak this time. She simply laid the folder on the table and gave a subtle nod of understanding. Her hand lingered a second too long, then she walked off, head high. Steven reached for the check, opened it, and slid a crisp bill inside. Keanu added his share without a word. As they stood, Dominic rose too. He walked toward them again, slower this time. Calculating. Keanu met his eyes calmly. Dominic didn't smile this time. He stopped just a few steps away and said, You think this is over? Keanu looked at him, voice steady. No, but your invisibility is. Steven took a step forward, just enough to close the distance if needed. His presence said more than words ever could. Dominic's mouth tightened, a deep red flush creeping up his neck. He leaned in slightly. You picked the wrong town. Keanu didn't move. You picked the wrong waitress. Dominic stood there for another moment. Then, with a breath that sounded like it cost him something, he stepped back. This isn't done, he muttered. Steven answered for both of them. Good, neither are we. Dominic turned, walking away stiffly, the room watching every step. But this time, no one looked away. The edge of the steak had gone cold, but neither Keanu nor Steven touched their plates again. Their eyes didn't leave the restaurant floor. The corner booth was empty now. Dominic and his crew were gone. They'd left just as quietly as they arrived, slipping out the front without fanfare, no confrontation. But the energy they dragged behind them still clung to the air like smoke. Keanu leaned forward slightly, scanning the room. Where's Rena? He asked. Steven glanced toward the service counter. Her apron wasn't there. The busing station was still piled with empty glasses and plates, but no sign of her. No new staff appeared and no sound came from the kitchen doors, just the clatter of dishes and the hiss of a fryer. She was just here, Steven said. Keanu looked toward the window that faced the back alley, the only exit other than the main door. Then Steven muttered, Something's wrong. They didn't run. They didn't call out. They didn't make a scene. They moved like men who'd been here before. Not to this place, but this kind of moment, where silence turned too quiet and the gut started to speak louder than reason. Keanu was first through the hallway that led to the emergency exit. Steven followed, his boots silent over the tile. The back door creaked open without resistance. Just beyond it, the summer night pressed in with a thick, heavy heat. The air smelled of grease from the kitchen's vent, of wet pavement and distant pine trees. The alley was dim. Only one security light glowed above the loading dock, flickering just enough to cast shadows where they shouldn't have been. Then they heard it. A voice. Male, low and angry. Another voice. Female, choked and strained. Keanu raised a hand, signaling Steven to hold position. He moved toward the sound without hesitation, his steps silent. Around the far corner, near the dumpster and the stacked crates, the voices grew clearer. Dominic's voice growled through the darkness. "You think they'll protect you? You think they matter?" Rena's voice broke in response. "Please, stop." The words caught on her breath. She wasn't screaming, she was trying not to. Like someone who had learned silence as a survival tactic. Keanu stepped closer, slow and careful. Then he saw them. Rena was pinned against the wall beside the dumpster, one of Dominic's hands clenched around her upper arm. The other hovered too close, fingers gripping the fabric of her shirt. Her apron was gone, her face was streaked with tears. Dominic leaned in, his mouth twisted, eyes dark and violent. "You think I won't ruin you?" he hissed. "You think anybody in there's going to save you?" Keanu stepped out from the shadows and into the weak light. His voice was even. "Let her go." Dominic turned his head slowly, still gripping Rena's arm like a vice. His expression didn't change at first, but something flickered in his eyes when he realized who had spoken. Keanu stepped further into the light, not rushing, not raising his voice, just present, calm, focused. "I said," Keanu repeated. "Let her go." Dominic let out a short, scoffing breath, but his grip didn't loosen. "You again," he muttered, shaking his head. "You just can't stay out of it, can you?" Keanu didn't move. "She's scared," Dominic went on, jerking his chin toward Rena. "Got herself worked up, started running her mouth. This is just a misunderstanding." Rena tried to speak, but Dominic clamped his fingers tighter, and she winced in pain. Steven appeared behind Keanu then, stepping around the corner with quiet force. His arms were at his sides, but the set of his shoulders spoke louder than words. Dominic's smile flickered. "2 for 1 now," he said. "You both gonna try and play white knight?" Steven's voice came low and sharp. "You're on thin ice already. And that was before you laid a hand on her." Dominic's eyes flashed, but he didn't let go. "You gonna hit me? Go ahead. See how that plays out. 2 washed-up actors roughing up a local businessman? I'll own this town even harder after the lawsuit hits." Keanu took a step closer, his tone still quiet but unmistakably firm. "You think this is about headlines?" Dominic didn't answer. Keanu's gaze never left his. "This is about a line, one you just crossed." There was a long pause. Dominic's jaw clenched. Rena's breathing was short and panicked. Her blouse was torn at the shoulder where he'd grabbed her. The fabric hung loose, as if clinging to her only out of habit. Finally, with a grunt of frustration, Dominic shoved her back. She stumbled but didn't fall. Keanu caught her gently by the shoulders, holding her steady. "Get inside," he said softly to her. She nodded, breath shaking, and pulled away from Dominic without looking back. Steven stepped closer to Dominic now, not quickly, not threatening, just with weight. "You lay another hand on her," Steven said, his voice flat as stone, "and you'll spend the rest of your life regretting it." Dominic looked between the two men, chest heaving, trying to hold on to whatever power he thought he still had. "You don't know who you're messing with," he spat. Keanu stared directly at him. "Yeah, we do. That's the problem." Dominic didn't respond. He stood there for a moment longer, fists trembling slightly at his sides. Then he turned, storming off into the dark without another word. But no one watching that alley believed he had given up. Not yet. The alley grew quiet again, except for the distant hum of the air conditioner and the fading sound of Dominic's boots scraping the pavement as he disappeared into the shadows. Rena clutched her torn blouse, trembling. She leaned against the wall, breathing hard, trying to hold herself together. Her shoulders shook, but she stayed upright. Keanu stood beside her, not saying anything at first, just present, solid. Steven moved to the far edge of the alley, scanning the parking lot. Dominic was gone. For now. "You're safe," Keanu said finally, voice soft. Rena shook her head, eyes still wet. No, I'm not. He's not done. He's never done. Steven walked back over. Then we'll be ready. She looked between them. You don't understand. He's always been like this. He gets away with it because people let him. They look away, or they pretend they didn't hear. He's got money. He's got friends in the county office. He knows where people work, where their kids go to school. And when someone finally stands up, he makes an example out of them. Keanu's face didn't move, but his eyes held firm. Not this time, he said. She let out a short laugh, bitter around the edges. I've said that before. I thought if I worked hard enough, stayed quiet, he'd just stop noticing me. Steven looked at her, arms folded. Men like him don't forget people they've tried to control, especially the ones who walk away. I didn't walk away, she whispered. I just got older. Keanu gently took off his denim jacket and offered it to her. She hesitated, then accepted it, pulling it around her shoulders. Her torn blouse disappeared under the thick fabric. He stepped back. You're not alone anymore. She blinked, and more tears came, though this time something shifted in her face. Her hands were still shaking, but her spine had straightened. Her breath wasn't as shallow. She stood a little taller. Steven nodded once. You stood up. That's more than most. She looked down at her feet, then back at the restaurant's back door. They're gonna ask questions when I go back in, Keanu replied. Then tell them the truth. And if no one listens, he answered quietly, they will. She nodded, just once. Then she turned and walked toward the door, Keanu's jacket cinched tightly around her frame. Steven and Keanu watched until she was back inside. When the door clicked shut behind her, Steven exhaled slowly. You know he's coming back. I know, Keanu said. Steven added, and this time he'll bring more than words. Keanu looked toward the end of the alley where Dominic had disappeared. The darkness seemed thicker there, as if it knew what was coming. Then we'll be waiting, he said. The sound of retreating footsteps hadn't faded more than a minute before it returned. Only this time, it was faster, heavier, meaner. Dominic stormed back into the alley from the opposite end, his stride uncoiled, his chest heaving like a man not used to being told no. His mouth twisted in a snarl as his eyes locked onto Keanu, who was still standing a few paces from the door. You should have stayed out of this, movie star, Dominic spat. She was handling it. Keanu didn't move. No, she was surviving it. Dominic took another step forward, fists clenched at his sides. You don't know how things work around here. Steven's voice broke the air from just behind Keanu. Calm, measured, dangerous. Jean told you to stop? Dominic turned toward him. You're both just passing through. This isn't your business. Keanu's tone dropped lower. You touched her. That's assault. Dominic barked a laugh. Oh, please. You think anyone's gonna care? You think there's security footage? She's a waitress. I was just talking to her, friendly disagreement. He glanced around the alley, arms open wide like a performance. You two jump me and I make a phone call. Suddenly it's Hollywood muscle breaking bones in a quiet town. Headlines, lawsuits. I'll own this place. Steven took a single step forward. Then why are you sweating? Dominic's jaw worked, but he didn't answer. His eyes flicked to the restaurant's back door, still closed. Then back to Keanu. You don't belong here, he muttered, voice sharp and low. You think you're helping her? You're just dragging her into something worse. He turned on his heel like he was going to leave, but then suddenly spun back and shoved Keanu hard with both hands. Keanu didn't stumble. His boots held steady. But Rena, who had just cracked open the back door to see what was happening, cried out in surprise. Dominic spotted her, smiled cruelly. See, she's the reason this all started. If she kept her mouth shut. He lunged forward, grabbed her by the wrist, and yanked. Rena screamed, stumbling forward. Her blouse tore at the shoulder, the fabric splitting with an ugly sound. Keanu was there in a breath. He caught her with one arm, gently steadying her. His body moved between her and Dominic without hesitation, calm but unmovable. Dominic backed up, hands raised, laughing like it was all a misunderstanding. Keanu didn't blink. That was your last mistake. Dominic's smile cracked, but he tried to keep it. This isn't over. Keanu took off his jacket and wrapped it around Rena's shoulders. She clutched it tight. Steven stepped closer beside them. His voice was quiet, almost a whisper. You're not alone anymore. Dominic stood frozen, eyes darting between them. And for the first time, he looked like the one who might run. Dominic's smirk faltered under the weight of silence. His hands were still half raised, but not in surrender. More like he couldn't decide whether to posture or back down. His breath came harder now, chest rising and falling under the darkening sky. Steven's stance hadn't changed, but the presence he gave off had. His eyes never left Dominic, sharp and clear, like a man who'd read this playbook before and wasn't impressed. Rena stood close to Keanu, jacket pulled tight around her, face pale but steady now. She didn't cry. Not anymore. But she didn't blink either. And she didn't look away from the man who had terrified her for years. You two think you're heroes, Dominic said finally, his voice hollow, grasping, coming in here like some kind of saviors. Keanu's voice was quieter than before, almost gentle. We're just not letting it slide. Dominic's jaw clenched again. You don't get it. People here listen to me. They trust me. You'll be gone by next week. But I'll still be here. Steven stepped forward now, just enough to close the distance to 2 strides. His boots touched the line between light and shadow. You might still be here, Steven said. But after tonight, they'll see you for what you are. Dominic opened his mouth like he wanted to retort, but nothing came. His eyes darted behind them, toward the back door of the restaurant. And it was clear what he was thinking. He was wondering who might be watching, who might have heard. He wiped a hand across his mouth and shook his head. This is a mistake. You're both going to regret this. Keanu tilted his head. That's not new. Men like you always say the same thing. Dominic's fingers twitched once, then curled into fists, but he didn't swing. Something in his body wanted to fight, but something in his instincts knew it would end badly. He backed up a step, muttering to himself. His confidence was slipping through the cracks. You'll see, he said again, though softer this time. This town's mine. No, Steven replied. He was just scared. That's different. Dominic stared a moment longer, then turned. This time he didn't strut. He walked off fast, shoulders hunched, boots loud on the pavement, as he disappeared into the shadows once more. The alley went quiet again. No threats, no smirks. Just the hum of the vent above them, and the stillness left behind when the predator left the scene. Keanu looked over at Rena. Her hands were still tight on the sleeves of his jacket, but her breathing had slowed. You all right? He asked. She nodded once. I think so. Steven's eyes stayed on the alley's edge. He'll be back. With friends. Keanu gave a slow nod. Then we'll stay ready. Rena wiped at her cheek with the back of her hand, brushing away what little was left of the tears. Her eyes weren't soft anymore. They were focused. Still shaken, but something inside had shifted. She wasn't shrinking, not anymore. Keanu gently adjusted the collar of his jacket on her shoulders, then glanced toward the back door of the restaurant. Do you want to go back in? He asked. She hesitated. People will have questions. I don't know what to say. Tell the truth, Steven said. If not for yourself, then for everyone who's been too afraid to. She swallowed hard, then nodded. He's not going to stop. You know that, right? He's going to come at me harder, at you too. Keanu's expression didn't change. That's what cowards do. They try one last time, after they've been seen. Rena exhaled slowly. I've never had anyone stand up for me before. Steven looked at her directly. It wasn't just for you. It was for the next person, too. The three of them stood in silence for a beat longer, surrounded by the hum of the night and the quiet buzz of a town that had looked away for too long. Rena turned and stepped toward the door. Her pace was measured, her back straight. Keanu and Steven followed close behind, but didn't crowd her. She pushed open the door and stepped inside. The din of the restaurant had shifted. Voices were lower. Some had clearly seen or heard part of what had happened. Eyes turned toward her as she entered, then drifted to Keanu and Steven as they followed. The silence grew noticeable. Travis stood near the hostess stand, pretending to wipe a counter that didn't need wiping. His face tightened when he saw Rena's torn blouse hidden under Keanu's jacket. He took a small step forward, but didn't speak. Keanu's eyes stayed on him. Steven's too. Rena didn't stop. She walked across the restaurant floor, past curious stares and half-finished meals, and stepped behind the counter, like it was still her job to do so. She looked to Keanu and Steven, then to the others. She didn't raise her voice, didn't shout. She just said, "Something happened, and it's time you all stop pretending it didn't." The entire room froze. Travis lowered the cloth in his hand. Steven placed a hand gently on the counter. Steady. Keanu stood beside Rena, his gaze steady and firm. The moment was small in action but massive in meaning, because the line had been crossed. And now, finally, someone was daring to stand on the right side of it. The air inside the restaurant felt heavier than before. Rena stepped in first, the weight of Keanu's jacket still draped around her shoulders. Her eyes darted briefly to the table where Dominic had been sitting. It was empty now. The booth looked darker, like the shadows were still hanging there. Behind her, Keanu and Steven followed quietly. Neither said a word, but the energy they brought in shifted the room. Conversations died mid-sentence. Forks hovered above plates. All eyes turned toward them. Rena didn't cower this time. She walked straight toward the counter, her feet sure even if her heart wasn't. She glanced at the staff. A few avoided her eyes. One older server looked at her with something like relief. Another busboy paused, then quickly looked down and kept moving. Across the room, Blake stood at the edge of the bar, flipping a bar towel nervously in his hands. His posture was stiff, his eyes fixed on the floor. He hadn't moved to help her earlier. He hadn't even asked what happened. Keanu walked up beside her and turned to Blake. His tone was calm, but unmistakably serious. "We need to talk." Blake blinked rapidly, trying to find the safety of sarcasm. "If this is about your food..." Steven cut him off with a voice as firm as a steel gate closing. "This is about what you've let happen in your father's restaurant." Blake glanced around like he hoped someone would rescue him, but no one did. He forced a weak laugh. "Look, I don't know what this is about, but you can't just barge in and..." "You watched it happen," Keanu said flatly. "You knew." Blake's jaw clenched. His towel dropped to the floor. The silence in the room cracked a little. Then, from behind the counter, Rena stepped forward. She took a deep breath. Her hands trembled slightly, but she didn't hide them. "I'm not trying to start trouble," she said, loud enough for the entire restaurant to hear. "But I'm done being scared." Keanu gave her a nod. Just once, that was all. Rena's voice shook at first, but each word began to gather weight as it left her mouth. "Dominic Crane," she said. "He's been coming here every Friday night. He harasses the staff. He corners customers. Last week, he told a Navy veteran he didn't belong here and made him leave without his dinner. And nobody said a word. Now people in the restaurant were frozen. A few shifted in their seats. One woman gasped softly. Rena went on. "He used to bully me in high school, lock me in closets. Now he wears a suit and calls himself a businessman, but he's still doing the same thing, only now he's got people too scared to speak." She turned to Blake. "And you knew. You saw it. You let it happen." Blake's face turned pale. The restaurant went completely still. The truth had landed, and no one could pretend they didn't hear it. Blake opened his mouth, but nothing came out. He looked like a man caught between two collapsing walls, hoping one would fall slower than the other. Steven took a step forward. "You don't get to pretend anymore." Blake's eyes darted toward the kitchen door. "You don't understand. My father's sick. I'm just trying to keep things together." "And you thought silence was the safest way," Keanu said. "But silence doesn't protect people. It buries them." At a corner table, an older woman in a red sweater, one of the regulars, put her fork down and quietly added, "She's right. They made us all afraid." A man in a baseball cap nodded. "They told my wife to watch her tone when she asked for another table. We never came back until tonight." Another server, a young man with braces and acne scars, stepped forward from the kitchen. "They call me Runner Boy. Push me around every time," I told Blake. "He said to just ignore them." Blake's face reddened. "I didn't think it would go this far." "You didn't think," Rena said softly. "That was the problem." The words weren't loud, but they sliced cleaner than any raised voice could. Blake looked at her for a long moment. Then his shoulders slumped. I didn't know what to do," he whispered. "You do now," Keanu replied. Rena stepped toward the center of the dining room. Everyone watched her, not out of pity, but something deeper. Respect earned in real time. "I know I'm just a waitress," she said, "but this place used to feel safe, warm, familiar. My mom used to bring me here for my birthday. And now, I'm afraid every Friday night because of one man." Her voice cracked. She looked at Steven, then Keanu. Their presence steadied her, but the courage came from within. "Hal told me not to speak," she said, "but I just did." Steven crossed his arms. "And you won't be alone again." A silence followed. Not the fearful kind. This one carried weight, change, a shift. Then, quietly, someone at the back of the restaurant began to clap. It wasn't loud, it wasn't even confident, but it spread, first to the couple by the window, then the man with the baseball cap, the woman in red, then the staff. The room erupted into a slow, rhythmic applause. Not for drama, for truth. Rena looked stunned. Her hand flew to her mouth. She hadn't expected it, not like this. And that was when Blake finally looked her in the eye. "I'm sorry," he said. Blake took a slow breath, then turned to face the rest of the room. He looked smaller than before, less the manager trying to keep order, and more the son of a man who built a place. He didn't know how to defend. "I should have done something when it started," he admitted. "But I didn't. I thought if I stayed neutral, they'd go away, that I could protect this place by keeping my head down." Keanu stepped beside Rena. "Evil doesn't vanish when you ignore it. It gets comfortable." Blake nodded. "You're right." The young server behind the counter came forward again. "Blake, if you make a change now, we'll back you. We just needed to know you cared." That hit something in Blake. His voice cracked. "Then let's take it back. Starting now." He turned and looked around the room. "Nobody should be afraid to eat here, or to work here. Not ever again." One of the older waitresses stepped out from the kitchen. "Your dad wouldn't have let it get this far. You still have a chance to fix it." Steven placed a hand gently on Blake's shoulder. "Then fix it." There was a moment of stillness, and then Blake walked over to the wall behind the counter. He reached up and took down a small, dusty frame. Inside was a black and white photo of his father on opening day. Grinning, apron dusted with flour, standing beside a cook who looked like he'd been through 2 wars and still had more kindness than words. Blake set it down where everyone could see it. "Tomorrow," he said, "I'm calling a meeting. No more looking the other way. No more free meals for Dominic Crane or his friends. No more intimidation." The applause that followed wasn't as loud as before, but it was firmer, more grounded. Rena, who had barely moved during the last minute, turned toward Keanu and Steven. Her face was flushed, eyes bright. "I don't know what just happened," she said softly, "but it feels like the floor shifted." Steven smiled. Sometimes the floor needs shaking, Keanu added, especially when the truth's been buried beneath it. Rena wiped her eyes with the corner of her sleeve, then straightened her back. For the first time in months, she said, I'm not afraid to clock in tomorrow. Keanu gave her a quiet nod. That's what truth does. And for the first time that evening, the tension in the air began to fade. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was earned. Blake stood frozen behind the counter, rubbing the back of his neck as if the tension in the room had suddenly become too much to bear. His face flushed with a mixture of guilt and frustration, and when he finally spoke, his voice was small, almost apologetic. I wasn't trying to ignore it, he said. I was just trying to keep the peace. You don't know what they're capable of. If I push back too hard, they'll shut us down. Keanu turned slightly toward him. There's no peace in fear, he said quietly. Blake met his eyes for a moment, but then looked away. You don't understand, man. They've got lawyers, connections in the county. They've already threatened to report us for health code violations. I've got payroll to meet. If this place folds, 10 people lose their jobs. My mom. This was her dream before she passed. I'm just trying to keep it alive. Steven's voice came low and steady. Silence isn't neutral. It sides with power. That stopped Blake cold. His hands gripped the counter tighter. The words didn't shout. They didn't accuse, but they hit like a punch to the ribs, because they were true. From the corner of the bar, a stool creaked as someone shifted. An older man stood up slowly. He wore a navy ball cap, denim jacket with a faded patch on the sleeve, and the slow steadiness of someone who didn't speak unless it mattered. I stopped coming here, the man said, voice gravelly, after what happened in the bathroom with that black vet. I saw it. I heard the words they used, and I watched nobody do a thing. Blake's mouth opened, but nothing came out. The man took a breath. I served 22 years. I've buried friends. I've seen enemies. But nothing disappoints a man like cowardice from his own. There was a silence so thick it felt like time stopped. A few heads nodded around the room. Then a woman in a gray cardigan near the window added quietly, My niece applied here twice. Never got a call back. She's black and gay. I didn't want to believe that had anything to do with it. But after watching tonight, maybe I was wrong. Blake looked like he'd aged 10 years in 2 minutes, his lips pressed into a hard line. I didn't know. Yes, you did, said the woman gently. You just didn't want to see it. Rena was still near the middle of the floor, her apron now folded over one arm. She hadn't moved much since speaking up earlier, but now she stepped forward again. Her voice was steadier this time, firmer but not angry. If we let this keep going, she said, we're telling every person who walks through those doors, you don't matter. Rena's words hung in the air like a church bell struck during silence. Clear, solemn, and impossible to ignore. A busboy, maybe 17, stepped out from behind the kitchen door, nervously wiping his hands on his apron. They scared me too, he admitted. They'd snapped their fingers at me. One of them pushed me into the dish bin when I dropped a glass. I didn't say anything because I thought, maybe that's just how the world works. Steven looked at him and nodded once, slow and affirming. It doesn't have to. Another voice came from behind the dessert case, one of the older waitresses, Carla, who had been working at Oaks and Iron since the beginning. You know what breaks my heart, she said. I used to be proud of this place. I watch families grow up in here, kids learning to cut steak, first dates, anniversaries, proposals. But lately it's felt like a storm rolling in and never leaving. Everyone's just waiting to get soaked. Blake finally sank onto a stool behind the counter. His hands ran through his hair, and he didn't try to defend himself this time. Keanu walked over to the window where sunlight used to beam in before evening fell. He looked out at the darkened parking lot. Fear doesn't just rot from the outside, he said, still facing the glass. It eats from the inside, slowly, silently. until the place you love becomes something else, something you don't even recognize. The room stayed hushed, the weight of the moment settling like dust. Blake raised his head. What am I supposed to do? Kick them out? They'll retaliate. You don't know Dominic. Rena stepped forward. Yes, I do. I went to school with him. He bullied me every day for 4 years, locked me in closets, ruined my books, told me no one would ever care what I had to say. She swallowed, her throat tight, but continued. And maybe he still believes that. But tonight, I decided to stop believing it too. Keanu turned to face Blake. You have a chance right now, a small one, but it's still a chance. Stand up, and you won't be standing alone. A low murmur rippled again through the room. People were no longer whispering. They were exchanging glances. Eyes wide, postures upright, as if something inside them was quietly clicking into place. Steven stepped forward. You run a business, Blake, but you also hold a legacy, one your mother built on community. You either protect that or you bury it. Blake looked around the restaurant, not just at the walls or the chairs or the lights, but at the people, his people. And for the first time, he didn't see customers. He saw witnesses. Blake finally stood up. His voice was quiet at first, but steady. If I don't act now, then this place really is gone. Not burned down, but hollowed out. And I won't be the one who let that happen. He turned toward the staff. Rena, Carla, Jacob. I'm sorry, I let fear make my decisions, but not anymore. A spark returned to Rena's eyes, and she nodded slowly. Carla smiled, small but proud. Even the busboy stood a little straighter. Steven crossed his arms and added, He'll be back. You know that. Blake looked at him. Then I'll be ready. From the bar, the older veteran spoke up again. We'll all be ready. One by one, patrons began speaking out. I stopped bringing my kids here. My dad used to love this place. He stopped coming after those men laughed when he spilled water. I was told I wasn't welcome here. I thought I was the only one. The dam had broken. In the middle of it all, Rena exhaled deeply, her shoulders finally beginning to ease. She looked at Keanu with gratitude that didn't need words. And as Keanu placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, the restaurant, for the first time in a long time, began to feel like home again. A strange quiet fell over the steakhouse, like someone had drawn a curtain between two worlds. One side stirred with quiet conviction, voices murmuring, hearts awakening. The other side? Still, suspicious, uncomfortable. Chairs scraped gently against wood floors as a handful of patrons slipped out, coats tight around their shoulders, eyes averted. No one spoke as they left. No one asked them to stay. Blake stood in the center of it all, frozen between two futures. His eyes flicked toward the back booth, where just an hour ago Dominic Crane had lounged like a king. The shadow of that presence still lingered, like a sour taste no one could wash out. Keanu watched him carefully, not judging, just present. You don't have to be a hero, he said softly, the weight of 1,000 silent battles in his voice. Just stop being afraid. Blake's jaw tightened. His lips parted to say something, but nothing came. He looked down at his hands, the same hands that had once taken his father's keys, full of pride, and opened this place for business. Now they trembled, but he didn't walk away. He didn't fold. Not yet. At the same moment, Rena returned to the floor. No apron, just herself. She walked through the dining area and straight back toward the kitchen without hesitation. The silence followed her like a tide, but she never once looked down. Each step was steady, like her dignity had been waiting in that alley and had finally returned to walk beside her. Steven leaned toward Keanu, voice low. She's braver than most. Keanu nodded, eyes still on Blake. Yeah, he said. And maybe she just gave the others permission to be brave too. Near the bar, the older veteran had taken a seat again, sipping his drink with hands that had clearly held more weight than just a glass. He looked around the room, searching faces, measuring the mood. No one moved, but something had. Blake finally moved, not with flair or noise, but with a quiet sort of shame. He walked toward the counter where the order slips were stacked and tore off a page. His fingers fidgeted with the edge as he read the names scribbled across it, staff who had clocked in that day, including Rena's. He looked toward the kitchen. The stainless steel doors swung gently as cooks passed through, steam curling into the air. Rena wasn't hiding anymore, but she wasn't returning to the floor either. She was waiting, maybe hoping. For him? For anyone. Blake turned to face the room again. "I didn't know how to fight him," he said, voice carrying just enough to be heard by everyone still inside. "Dominic made himself bigger than this place, bigger than the town. But I let it happen." No one interrupted. "I watched good people walk away. My own staff, my customers. I thought staying quiet would protect the restaurant. My family's name. I didn't realize silence was the same as permission." The room absorbed his confession like dry wood absorbs rain, slow but total. From the booth, Keanu sat back, arms folded lightly. He gave Blake space. Steven's expression didn't soften, but he gave a slow nod, a small gesture, one that meant it's not too late. A woman near the entrance spoke up next. "I'm the one who left with my daughter last month. When Dominic said something about her hair," her voice wavered, but didn't break. "She's 10. She didn't understand what he meant. But I did." Another man, in his 30s, raised his hand slightly. "I got told not to dress like that if I wanted to eat here. All I had on was a hoodie and jeans." The ripples grew, a quiet chorus of validation. Stories that had gone unsaid began surfacing. Faces that had carried shame now shared fragments of it, like passing the weight from one set of shoulders to many. No one cried. Not yet. But the air thickened with a shared reckoning. Blake leaned forward against the counter. "If we're going to fix this, it starts tonight." He turned toward Keanu and Steven, meeting their eyes for the first time without flinching. "I don't know what to do, but I want to do something." Keanu stood slowly, not towering or dramatic, just present, grounded. "Then do the opposite of what he did." Blake blinked. "Which is, make space for others, and mean it." Blake nodded slowly. Then, without a word, he walked to the restaurant door and flipped the sign from open to closed. Customers inside looked at one another, confused, curious. But Blake turned to them with something close to authority. "We're closing early tonight, and reopening tomorrow, differently." He walked back behind the counter, picked up the phone, and called his father. "Dad," he said simply, "we need to talk. About everything." In the kitchen, Rena paused mid-step as the cooks fell silent. She heard him. Everyone did. Keanu and Steven exchanged a look. Not triumph, not relief, but the calm that comes when a shift begins. Subtle. Real? Rena emerged once again and returned to the floor, standing beside Blake. No fear in her shoulders now. Later, Steven murmured to Keanu, "That took guts." Keanu replied, "So does rebuilding." And as they walked back toward their booth, the atmosphere had changed. The danger wasn't gone, but it was no longer invisible. That, Keanu knew, was how real change always began. One truth at a time, spoken out loud, in the light. Blake looked around the room again. This time, he didn't look at the floor. He looked people in the eye. "I'll call my father tonight," he said. "Tell him what's been happening here, and that I let it happen. No more hiding behind tradition or silence." He stepped toward the kitchen and opened the swinging doors. "Rena." She turned slowly. Her eyes were red, but her chin lifted. "You still want to finish your shift?" Rena hesitated, then nodded. "Only if I'm not finishing it alone." Blake looked to the other staff standing in the back. Busboys, line cooks, a dishwasher named Eli who'd worked there for 15 years. They began stepping forward one by one. Steven leaned over and said softly to Keanu, "Told you, she's braver than most." Keanu smiled faintly. Sometimes the bravest thing is just staying. They watched as the kitchen slowly filled again. As the fear thinned, as the restaurant, little by little, became something else. Not perfect, but human. The last light clicked off in the restaurant behind them. Keanu and Steven stepped out into the summer air, the kind that clung to your shirt and hummed with the sound of distant crickets. The small town had gone quiet, save for the low buzz of neon signs and the whir of an overhead street lamp. Keanu took a breath, the kind that held weight. Steven cracked his neck gently and glanced up at the stars. Neither said a word, but both knew the night wasn't finished with them yet. Then the growl of an engine, loud, angry. Headlights tore through the darkness as a mat-snapped pickup truck screeched into the gravel lot. Dust exploded around it, spilling into the warm air like a warning. Doors flew open with reckless force. 4 men jumped out, not subtle, not careful. One spun a folding knife between his fingers, catching the streetlight on each turn like a signal. Another held a large flashlight, metal, heavy, resting it across his shoulder like a club. A third man rolled up his sleeves and cracked his knuckles. The fourth hung back, quiet, but the way he moved made it clear he was no less dangerous. Dominic Crane was the last to step out. He didn't rush, he didn't raise his voice. He walked with that same smugness they'd seen earlier in the booth, only now it was darker. Less for show, more for something primal. He stopped just a few feet from Keanu and Steven, feet planted like he owned the ground beneath them. "I told you it wasn't over," he said. Keanu didn't blink. Steven didn't flinch. They just stood there, side by side. Dominic laughed under his breath. "This little act of yours, walking into our town like it's a movie scene, thinking people still care who you are, it ends tonight." No one moved. Keanu's voice was calm. "You should leave." Dominic grinned. "You first." Behind him, the man with the knife flicked it open. The man with the flashlight adjusted his grip. The air thickened. Every sound in the world seemed to pause. Keanu's stance didn't change. Calm. Feet shoulder-them apart. No fear in his eyes, just stillness. Like the center of a storm. Steven's hand lowered slightly, just enough to show he'd be faster than any of them. He scanned the 4 men, clocking their spacing, their posture, the slight tells in their breathing. These weren't trained fighters. They were loud, reckless, but dangerous in their own way. Men who thought violence made them powerful. "You know what I hate?" Steven said, his voice low and steady. "The smell of cowardice. It always shows up when the sun goes down." Dominic chuckled, but it was tight, forced. Big words from old men. "Young enough," Steven replied, tilting his chin. The man with the knife stepped forward first. Fast hands, but not fast enough. In a single pivot, Steven caught his wrist mid-swing, yanked it down, and delivered a sharp elbow to the man's throat. The knife clattered to the pavement as the man dropped, gasping. That set off the others. The flashlight came swinging toward Keanu's head. He ducked effortlessly, grabbed the man's arm, and twisted it backward. The weapon fell. Keanu didn't punch. He stepped forward, placed his forearm against the man's chest, and drove him back until his spine met the side of the truck with a hard thud. Another tried to rush Steven from the side, but Steven moved like water, grabbing the attacker's belt and collar, redirecting his momentum into a brutal shoulder toss that left the man sprawled on the gravel. Only one remained now, Dominic. His smirk was gone. What was left was fury. He lunged forward, wild, fist swinging with no rhythm, no discipline, just hate. Keanu didn't back up. He didn't counter. He let Dominic's fist graze his cheek, then stepped into him, grabbed his collar with one hand and his belt with the other, and spun him off balance. Dominic landed hard on the ground, his breath ripped from his lungs. He rolled, wheezing, trying to get up again, but Steven was already standing over him. "Enough," Keanu said firmly. Dominic froze, blood at the corner of his mouth. And for the first time, there was fear in his eyes. Dominic tried to speak, but his breath was shaky, lips parted in disbelief. He looked between Keanu and Steven, as if only now realizing they hadn't come here by accident. He had spent the night trying to act like the king of the hill, but now he was the one lying in the dirt, exposed. Keanu knelt down beside him, but there was no gloating in his voice, no smugness in his posture, just quiet intensity. "You don't have to live this way," Keanu said. "Tearing people down just to feel tall. Hurting someone like Rena doesn't make you powerful, it makes you empty." Dominic's jaw twitched. "You don't know me." "You're right," Keanu answered, "but I know what it means to be broken. I've just chosen not to pass it on." Behind them, the man with the knife was crawling away slowly, holding his neck. The others staggered to their feet in silence, all bravado drained. None of them dared to come near again. Steven picked up the folding knife and tossed it into a nearby dumpster. Keanu stood and turned his back on Dominic, not out of arrogance, but because he knew the fight was over. Not just physically, spiritually. Dominic didn't get up. He just lay there, hands clutching gravel, breath slowing. For once, there was no threat on his tongue, just silence. Back inside the restaurant, a few people peeked through the windows, having heard the commotion. Blake stood in the doorway, pale-faced, watching, Rena behind him. When she saw Keanu and Steven walk back toward the entrance. Unharmed, composed, changed, she stepped forward and opened the door. Steven gave a small nod, wiping dust from his hands. Keanu paused just before stepping back inside. "Tomorrow," he said quietly, "this place will decide what it stands for." And with that, the door closed behind them, leaving Dominic in the night, surrounded by his own choices. The summer air tightened, thick with tension. The distant hum of cicadas was swallowed by the crunch of gravel as the four men from Dominic's truck began to fan out. No one spoke. No one laughed now. The first man to move was tall and wiry, his steps erratic but fast. He lunged toward Keanu with the folding knife, blade glinting under the parking lot lights. In a fluid, trained motion, Keanu shifted his weight, sidestepped, caught the man's wrist midair, and twisted sharply. A snap echoed, painful but not bone-breaking. The knife clattered to the pavement. The man howled, but before he could recover, Keanu kicked the knife across the lot, well out of reach. A second thug charged from behind, swinging a metal flashlight like a club. Steven turned to meet him without hesitation. The man was larger, swinging with raw power, but Steven had balance. He absorbed the momentum, blocked with a raised elbow, then pivoted and swept the man's legs with brutal grace. The flashlight flew from his hands as he landed hard on his back, air rushing from his lungs in a grunt. Dominic watched his men fall and growled in frustration. He surged forward, straight at Keanu. Fists flew. Dominic swung with fury, all brute force and recklessness. Keanu didn't waste a breath. He ducked, blocked, redirected. His movements were tight, efficient, emotionless. A hard right from Dominic grazed his temple. Keanu responded with two fast jabs to the ribs and a palm strike to the chest that staggered the man backward. Dominic roared, "You think this makes you a hero?" Keanu's eyes were steady. "No, just not a coward." The third attacker, a stocky man with tattoos up his neck, charged Steven with a broken pool cue. Steven dodged left, redirected the man's own momentum, and slammed his shoulder into the man's chest, sending him tumbling onto the gravel. In seconds, it was down to Dominic. Bleeding, breathless, he reached for the nearest thing, an empty beer bottle from the trash bin. He smashed it on the curb, shards glittering in his grip. He lunged again. Keanu moved forward without flinching. Keanu didn't need to speak. His posture said everything. Calm, grounded, centered. As Dominic slashed forward with the jagged glass, Keanu ducked and pivoted. The swing missed by inches. He caught Dominic's wrist again, but this time there was no hesitation. With a swift twist and pressure on a nerve point, the weapon dropped. Keanu stepped in, pressed his forearm across Dominic's chest, and pinned him against the side of the truck. The impact rattled the vehicle. Dominic froze, trapped between rage and humiliation. His breathing turned ragged. Keanu leaned in close, voice steady and low. "You like fear. You use it like a weapon, but not tonight." Dominic's eyes darted behind Keanu, desperate to see if his men were coming to his aid. But they weren't. Two of them were still groaning in the gravel. One was crawling toward the truck. The fourth, still stunned from Steven's takedown, was limping away toward the road. Steven stood nearby, arms crossed, watching it all with the cool stillness of someone who had faced worse and won. He didn't gloat. He didn't smile. He simply waited. Dominic let out a defeated snarl and shoved at Keanu's arm, but it didn't budge. Keanu wasn't holding him in anger. He was holding him with purpose, controlled, resolved. "You're not invisible anymore," Keanu said, letting the words sink in. "Everyone's watching now." With that, he released Dominic and stepped back. Dominic stumbled, caught himself, and looked around, disoriented and breathless. His empire of fear had fractured in a single night. Bloodied and bruised, he staggered toward the truck. One of his men opened the door for him, eyes swollen shut. Another limped behind, silent. As Dominic pulled himself into the driver's seat, he turned and glared through the cracked windshield. "You don't know what you've started," he spat. Steven walked to Keanu's side, gaze locked on the truck. "No," Keanu said quietly. "You don't." The engine roared to life, then faded into the distance as red taillights disappeared down the road. Silence returned to the parking lot. Only the sound of the wind and the slow creak of the restaurant sign swinging above them remained. Keanu stood still for a moment longer, his chest rising and falling in measured breaths. Steven exhaled quietly beside him, shaking dust from his jacket sleeve. The adrenaline had faded, but something deeper lingered. An awareness that what had just happened wasn't just about fists and bruises. It was about drawing a line, clearly and without apology. The restaurant door creaked open behind them. Rena stepped out slowly, arms crossed tight against her chest. Her eyes darted toward the parking lot where Dominic's truck had disappeared, then to the bruises on Keanu's knuckles and the dirt streaked across Steven's jeans. "Are you okay?" she asked softly. "We are," Keanu replied. "Are you?" She nodded, but her lip trembled as she fought to stay composed. "I never thought anyone would actually stand up to him, not like that." Steven walked toward her and gently set a hand on her shoulder. "Sometimes people need a push to remember who they are." Rena blinked back a tear and gave a small nod. "You'll be back. You know that, right?" Keanu looked toward the horizon, where darkness folded over the edge of the town. Let him. But next time, he'll face more than two. Rena tilted her head in confusion. "Because now people have seen what fear really looks like when it loses," Steven explained, "and they've seen what it looks like when someone refuses to back down." A sudden rustling came from around the side of the building. For a second, all three tensed, but then a tall figure emerged from the shadows. It was the older man from earlier, the veteran who had spoken up in the restaurant. He limped slightly, a cane supporting his left side. His expression was thoughtful, but there was steel in his eyes. "I saw what happened," he said, voice low and steady. "That wasn't just a fight. That was a warning shot. You did what the rest of us forgot we could do." Keanu turned to him. "It's not about making a statement. It's about making a change." The man smiled faintly. "Well, you made both." Behind them, a few more lights flicked on across the small town street. Curtains stirred, heads peeked through windows, word was spreading. Not just of the fight, but of the shift. Steven glanced toward the restaurant. We should go inside, make sure Blake hasn't run off again. Rena smiled. He's still there, watching from the bar. Keanu gave a faint smirk. Good. Let's make sure he knows the night isn't over. As the trio moved back toward the restaurant door, the wind carried with it a strange new feeling. It wasn't victory. It wasn't relief. It was something simpler. Dignity reclaimed. And for the first time in a long time, the weight didn't feel so heavy anymore. Rena stood in the doorway, her body framed by the restaurant's flickering neon sign. The chaos had settled, but her hands still trembled. Her eyes locked onto the two men, Keanu and Steven, who now stood in the middle of the quiet parking lot, surrounded by a silence so heavy it buzzed. I thought... Her voice broke before she could finish. She pressed a hand to her chest. I thought they were going to kill you. Steven gave a small shake of the head, brushing the dust off his shirt. Bullies look dangerous when no one challenges them, but most of them don't know what to do when someone finally stands up. Rena looked down, then back up. But they had knives. They came for blood. Keanu took a step toward her. His eyes weren't filled with adrenaline anymore. They were soft. Still, they held the same quiet fire. You stood up first. You warned us. You faced them without backup. That's real courage. Her lips parted slightly as if she wasn't sure whether to accept the compliment or cry. I was just... scared. He nodded. So was I. Rena blinked. You? You didn't look it. That's the trick fear plays on us, Keanu said gently. It makes us believe we're alone in it. Steven added, but fear isn't weakness. It's just a signal. What matters is what you do next. Rena swallowed hard, then wiped under her eyes with her sleeve. Her voice wavered less this time. I wanted to scream, but I thought if I did, he'd hit me. Keanu stepped closer, his voice steady but warm. And instead, you found another way. You warned us. You got out. That's what saved tonight. She gave a half laugh through her tears. I don't feel very brave. That's what makes you brave, Steven replied. People who think they're invincible get careless. But people who act in spite of fear, they change things. Rena looked down at her apron, now wrinkled and stained. Then she took it off slowly, folding it in her hands. I don't think I can go back to just taking orders and pretending like I don't see what's happening around me. Keanu nodded. You won't have to. Rena glanced around the parking lot as if seeing it for the first time. The truck was gone, the shouting silenced, but the echoes of what had happened still lingered in the air like smoke. She looked back toward the restaurant, the place that had been her whole world since she dropped out of community college. The same place she had once been proud to work at. Now, it felt small, tight, too full of ghosts. Do you think he'll come back? She asked, not looking at either of them. Steven exhaled through his nose. Men like Dominic don't give up easily. They try to come back louder. But something shifted tonight. That truck rolled in full of power, and it limped out empty. He knows it, Keanu added. And more importantly, the town knows it now too. Rena hesitated. You think anyone will care? They all saw, they heard me. Some looked away. Then we looked, Steven said. But they didn't walk away. That's something. They're watching now. And if someone else stands up next time, it won't feel so impossible. Keanu turned toward the restaurant. The lights were dim inside. A few employees still lingered, peeking through the blinds, half expecting Dominic to return. But it was different now. The fear hadn't vanished, but it had cracked. There was air in the room. Something had broken loose. You changed something tonight, Keanu said quietly. Not because you fought, but because you told the truth. Rena shook her head. I was shaking the whole time. That's why it mattered, Steven replied. Anyone can yell when they feel safe, but to speak when your voice is shaking? That's what moves people. A long pause settled between them, filled only by the hum of insects and the creak of an old sign swaying on its rusted chain. Then Rena asked a question that had clearly been forming for a while. "Why did you help me?" Steven looked to Keanu. The answer belonged to him. Keanu didn't flinch. "Because someone once helped me when no one else would. Because silence feels like drowning, and because no one should have to fight alone." Rena's breath hitched. For the first time in a long time, she believed that. Not just because he said it, but because they'd stayed. They hadn't just stepped in and left. They had remained in the aftermath, standing with her in the broken silence. The back door of the restaurant creaked open behind them. Blake stepped out, rubbing his hands on a rag, his expression uncertain. For a moment, it looked like he might retreat again. But instead, he walked slowly toward them. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there, his eyes flicking from Rena to Keanu to Steven. Then he cleared his throat. "I saw it all," he said quietly. "Out here, I mean. I was watching from the kitchen door." Rena looked at him with wary eyes. "And?" Blake hesitated. I froze. Again. "I don't know why that keeps happening to me. I thought I'd do better this time." Keanu studied him. "Courage doesn't always show up the first time. It's what you do next that matters." Blake shifted uncomfortably. "I don't expect you to forgive me, Rena, or to believe I'll change. But I'm going to try. Really try." Rena gave a small nod. "Not forgiveness. Not yet. But not rejection either." "I've been thinking about putting in my own name for the manager role," Blake added. "My dad's retiring soon. If I get it, this place will be different, safer, better." Steven raised an eyebrow. "Not just words?" Blake looked him in the eye. "Not just words." Keanu nodded once. "Then prove it. Not to us, to her." Blake swallowed hard, then turned and walked back inside. Not with swagger, but with purpose. The parking lot was still again. Rena finally broke the silence. "I don't know what happens tomorrow, but I want to come back." "You don't have to," Steven said. "You've done enough." Rena smiled faintly. "I want to. For me." Keanu looked at her for a moment, then said softly, "Then walk in tall." She nodded. "I will." The three of them started toward the back door, but Rena paused just before stepping inside. "You know, when I saw you two walk in earlier, I thought, they look out of place. But now," she turned, facing them fully, "this town feels more real because of you." Keanu smiled, not with pride, but something deeper. Recognition. "Sometimes," he said, "you have to be a stranger to remind people who they really are." Steven opened the door for her. "Let's go rewrite the ending." And with that, they stepped back inside, into a place that had once been silent, but now waited, just barely, with hope. The heat had begun to soften into something more bearable as the sun rose over the town. A soft breeze fluttered the faded awning over the diner entrance, but something was different now. Visibly, tangibly different. A hand-painted wooden sign had been hung near the register just beneath the daily specials board. The lettering was simple, bold, and unmistakably human. "This place serves everyone." Not printed by a machine, not ordered online. It looked like someone had taken their time to make it. Probably Blake. The strokes were uneven in places, but careful, intentional. There was no mistaking what it meant. Inside, the atmosphere hummed, not with tension, but with something warmer. Hope. It wasn't loud, but it was there in every corner. An elderly couple sat by the window sipping coffee. A pair of young girls, one white, one Latina, shared a basket of fries and giggles. A veteran in a ball cap with military patches nodded politely to the waitress. That waitress was Rena. She moved with ease now, her posture tall, her steps sure. No glancing over her shoulder, no hesitant pauses at tables with men in boots and ball caps. She poured coffee, smiled easily, laughed without flinching. Behind the counter, Blake worked with quiet diligence. He wiped surfaces that were already clean, checked orders twice. But his eyes scanned the room constantly, not from paranoia, but care. His presence felt anchored now. He greeted people as they came in, not like a manager on duty, but like a man slowly earning trust, one table at a time. Then the bell over the door jingled again. Heads turned. Keanu Reeves stepped in, followed closely by Seagal. But this time there was no hush, no whispers, no side glances, just a round of natural, curious acknowledgement, as if they were regulars, not invaders. Blake spotted them and gave a short nod, not the stiff kind of greeting that masked discomfort. This one had a hint of respect in it. "Good morning," he said. "Back for the ribeye?" Keanu smiled faintly. "If it's still as good as last time." "I've been watching the kitchen closely," Blake replied. "It's better." Steven chuckled. "We'll be the judge of that." Rena appeared just behind them, her notepad in hand. She looked brighter today, her hair pinned neatly, her eyes clear, her uniform crisp. "Your usual booth?" she asked with a confident smile. Keanu gave a small nod. "Please." As they sat, Rena walked ahead of them, no hesitation in her stride. There was no tremble in her fingers as she placed the menus down, though they didn't need them. Steven leaned toward her with a smirk. "You seem taller today." Rena grinned. "Maybe I am." The food arrived, hot and fast. Rena placed the plates down with ease, her movements smooth and practiced, but there was something new in the way she lingered. She stood just a second longer, as if silently soaking in the moment. Then she looked at them both. "I wanted to say something," she said quietly. "I've worked here 3 years, and until last week, I never thought anyone would stand up for me. I didn't think people like you even noticed people like me." Keanu looked at her gently. "We do. We always have." Rena glanced toward the register where the new sign hung. "That wasn't just for me. It changed something in this whole place." Steven nodded, cutting into his steak. "Good food doesn't mean much if people are afraid to eat it." She gave a soft laugh. "Well, now the food's good and the fear's gone." Then she turned and walked away, shoulders light. They watched her stop at another table, joking with a teenager about spilled ketchup. Her ease was no act. Something real had shifted. The door opened again. An older woman entered with a boy in a wheelchair, maybe 10 or 11. The boy's eyes were sharp, curious. His mother looked nervous, like she hadn't walked into a place like this in a long time. Blake stepped out from behind the counter and approached them. "Welcome," he said. "Anywhere you'd like." The mother hesitated, looking around. Her eyes landed on the sign. She touched the boy's shoulder and whispered something. Then, they chose a table near the center. Blake brought the menus himself, crouching slightly to be at the boy's eye level. "If you need more room for the chair, we can slide that table back a little. Just let us know." The boy smiled. The mother blinked quickly, her eyes glistening. She mouthed, "Thank you," as Blake returned to the counter. Keanu watched it all unfold with quiet admiration. "You think it'll stick?" Steven asked, his tone casual, but not unfeeling. Keanu took a sip of his water. "It depends on what happens when we're not here." Steven leaned back in his seat, folding his arms. "People like Dominic don't go away. They wait. They sneak back in when no one's looking." "But now," Keanu said, "more people are looking." A moment passed. Then something unexpected happened. An older man walked over to their table, holding a folded newspaper. His hands were veined and rough. A patch on his jacket read, "Korea Veteran." He stood for a second before speaking. "I was here last week," he said. "Saw the whole thing." Didn't say a word. Felt like a coward walking out that door. Keanu gestured for him to sit. He did. "I just wanted you to know," the man continued. "After what I saw that night, I went home and talked to my grandson about it. Told him silence helps no one. And I think maybe I needed to see someone take a stand before I remembered how." Steven nodded slowly. Sometimes it just takes one person." The man looked toward Rena. "That girl reminded me of my daughter. She used to work night shifts just like that. If someone had hurt her and I didn't know..." He didn't finish. He didn't need to. He stood again, steady now. "Thank you," he said. Keanu didn't smile. He just placed a hand on the man's shoulder for a moment. The veteran nodded, then returned to his table. By the time the check came, the restaurant had settled into a peaceful rhythm. Families eating, forks clinking, laughter rising and falling. No shadows lingered in corners, no ghosts haunted booths. The fear that had once curled beneath the surface had been scraped out like rot from old wood. As Keanu and Steven stood to leave, Rena rushed over one last time. "I have something for you," she said. "It's silly, but..." She reached into her apron and pulled out a small hand-folded napkin. On it, in careful pen strokes, she'd written the same words that hung behind the register. "This place serves everyone." But beneath it, she'd added in smaller letters, "Because someone brave enough reminded us we could." Keanu unfolded it slowly, reading it in full silence. Then he folded it again, tucked it into his pocket, and nodded once. "Keep serving," he said. "We'll be back." The sun had begun to lower just slightly outside the wide front windows, casting a warm amber hue over the tables and booths. The restaurant's hum was steady and calm, the chaos of the previous week now something that lived only in memory. Keanu and Steven sat in their usual booth, plates cleared, coffee cups half full. The calm after the storm was not just external, it had settled into the bones of the place. Keanu reached for the check folder as Rena approached, wiping her hands on a fresh towel tucked into her apron. He tucked a crisp $100 bill inside and slid it toward her across the table. She blinked. "Sir, that's too much." Keanu looked up at her, his expression kind but unwavering. Not for the courage it took. Rena stood still for a moment, the folder in her hand, as if unsure what to do with both the gesture and the words. She nodded slowly, gratitude showing in the tightness of her throat, her chest rising and falling faster than usual. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice just barely over a breath. "Thank you for seeing me, for staying." Steven gave her a small smile, and Keanu just nodded again. The silence wasn't awkward. It was full of everything they all understood without saying. Then Rena hesitated. She shifted her weight slightly, biting her bottom lip, her eyes darting to the window for just a second before returning to Keanu. "There's something I've been meaning to say," she said. "That night, when I whispered to you in the hallway, I thought you'd just leave." Her voice cracked on the last word, but she pushed through it. "I thought you'd maybe roll your eyes, pay your bill, walk out, and I'd never see you again. That's what people usually do when they realize someone like me isn't worth the trouble." Keanu's expression didn't flinch. He just looked at her and said, "We don't walk away from people trying to do what's right." Her breath caught. "You didn't just help me," she added. "You reminded me I had the right to ask for help." Keanu leaned back slightly in the booth, folding his hands loosely in front of him. His gaze held steady, sincere, quiet. "You didn't need anyone's permission to matter, Rena," he said gently. "You just needed someone to remind you that you already did." She nodded, slowly, like his words were filling a space inside her that had been hollow for far too long. Then her eyes drifted downward. She opened the check folder again, stared at the bill resting there, then closed it softly. "I've worked here 5 years," she said, "and in 5 years I don't think anyone's ever said anything like that to me." Steven glanced at her with warmth. "Sometimes truth gets buried under habit, and habit makes cowards out of good people." Rena gave a small laugh, but it was tinged with emotion. "And you two are definitely not in the habit of looking away." Keanu smiled. "We've had our fair share of mistakes, but looking away? That's never been an option." She lingered at the table longer than a waitress normally would, not to stall, just to be present. Because this wasn't about orders anymore, it was about people, about healing, about reclaiming something she'd almost forgotten she had. "I almost didn't say anything that night," she said, eyes scanning the room behind them. "I kept hearing this voice in my head telling me to stay quiet, that it wasn't worth it, that nothing would change. And yet you said it," Keanu said. "I did," her voice wavered, "and the world shifted." Steven leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table. "You know, change doesn't always start with big speeches or loud protests. Sometimes it starts with a whisper in a hallway and someone choosing not to ignore it." He smiled through a tear that had slipped out without permission. "It feels like the first time I've taken a deep breath in months." Behind her, the kitchen buzzed again. Normal restaurant life. But this moment felt different, like the restaurant had inhaled too. Then she straightened her spine and wiped the corner of her eye. "All right, you'll make me cry in front of the dinner crowd. I gotta get back." As she turned to leave, Keanu called out, "Rena!" She looked over her shoulder. "You stood up first," he said. "That's something no one can take from you." She nodded, not shyly, but with certainty. The kind of certainty that sticks, that becomes a part of who you are. As she walked away, Steven let out a breath and looked around the room. The new sign on the wall caught his eye again, painted by hand, bold and uneven. "This place serves everyone." "Not bad," he murmured. Keanu followed his gaze. "It's not just paint, it's a decision." The door opened then. A young couple walked in. Black man, white woman. Holding hands, scanning the room cautiously. Rena greeted them before Blake even noticed. She led them to a booth with a quiet smile, offering menus without hesitation. The couple exchanged a glance, visibly relieved. Steven tapped the table lightly. "That's change." "And it started with one voice," Keanu said. Then another, then another. They sipped the rest of their coffee in silence. Not the silence of retreat, but of peace. The kind that comes when you've done something that mattered and left a place better than how you found it. Before they stood to leave, Keanu took a pen from his jacket pocket and scribbled something on the back of a napkin. He folded it and left it under the coffee cup. When Rena came back to clear the table 10 minutes later, she found it. She opened the napkin, unfolded it gently. The words were simple. "Keep standing. The world needs more people like you." No name signed, but she knew. She held the napkin to her chest for a long time before placing it carefully in her apron pocket, right next to her heart. The air outside the restaurant was cooler now, the summer heat finally giving way to a breeze that rustled the trees lining the empty parking lot. Crickets chirped softly in the dark. The neon sign above the front window hummed faintly, casting a bluish glow onto the cracked pavement below. Keanu and Steven stood near the curb, their hands in their pockets, watching the silence unfold. It wasn't the kind of silence that came from fear, not anymore. It was the quiet of things settling, like dust after a storm. And for the first time in a long while, it didn't feel like trouble was about to roll back in. Steven let out a slow breath. "Funny, isn't it? You spend a whole career fighting villains on screen, but it's these little moments that feel the most real." Keanu nodded slowly. "Because they are. No special effects, no retakes, just people. Trying to do the right thing, sometimes succeeding." They both looked back toward the restaurant. Through the window, they could see Rena at the counter, wiping it down with an easy rhythm. No flinching at shadows, no glancing over her shoulder. Just working, living. "That girl," Steven said softly. "She's got grit." "She was always brave," Keanu replied. "She just needed someone to remind her it wasn't wasted." The parking lot stretched out in front of them. No trucks roaring in, no boots stomping out of vehicles with fists clenched and threats ready. Just peace. For tonight, at least. Steven looked up at the stars, the kind you only see clearly in small towns. "The world doesn't change in a night," he said, "but sometimes a night shows you it can." Keanu's expression was thoughtful. "Sometimes all it takes is one place, one moment, One voice that refuses to stay silent. Steven glanced at him. Sometimes it takes two. They both chuckled quietly. It wasn't prideful. It was tired, knowing laughter. The kind that comes after standing your ground when you didn't have to, but knew you couldn't live with yourself if you didn't. Then Keanu grew quiet again. You know, it's easy to think small places don't matter, that no one notices. But this, what happened here, it does matter. Yeah, Steven agreed. Because it reminds people what's possible. Keanu turned slightly, leaning against the post by the curb. Most people aren't looking for heroes. They're looking for permission to care, to act. They just need a little light, someone to go first. Steven tilted his head. And if they don't have that? Keanu gave a faint smile. Then we keep going first. Steven stepped off the curb and walked a slow circle around the lot, the scuffed soles of his boots crunching lightly against gravel. It's strange, he said. For years I've seen things. Wars, betrayals, broken systems. Makes you jaded after a while. But tonight, watching a waitress stand taller than every man who tried to silence her, that gave me more hope than any headline in the last decade. Keanu watched him, then turned his gaze to the sky again. You know what I think? I think real change starts when people stop pretending they're too small to matter. Steven nodded. Yeah, but it's hard. Fear's a powerful thing. Makes good men freeze. Makes cowards sound brave. But courage, Keanu said quietly, is contagious too. They both stood there for a while, listening to the wind move gently across the rooftops, the distant hum of a car engine far down the road, the door of the restaurant clicking shut as Rena finally turned off the lights and locked up for the night. She didn't look over her shoulder. She didn't need to. She felt safe now. Or, at least, safer. Steven looked toward the spot where Dominic's truck had once parked, where the threats used to linger like oil stains that wouldn't scrub away. Now it was just pavement, empty and clean. That guy, Steven muttered, he'll be back. People like him don't go quietly. Keanu didn't flinch. Maybe, but next time he won't have silence on his side. And the town? Keanu's eyes narrowed slightly. They've seen something different now. Can't unsee it. A place that stayed quiet for years just heard its own voice for the first time. Steven smirked. Not bad for a couple guys who just came in for a steak. Keanu grinned faintly. The steak was terrible, by the way. Steven burst out laughing. Absolutely awful. I think that cook's still using charcoal from the Eisenhower administration. Their shared laughter faded into the night, easy and unforced, the kind that came when the weight of injustice had finally cracked and something good had leaked through. Steven checked his watch. We should get moving, road's long, and I've got a feeling the next place needs us just as much. Keanu looked back at the restaurant one last time. The sign was still in the window, hand-painted, a little crooked, but bold. This place serves everyone. He nodded slowly. Yeah, but if they ever need us again? Steven answered before the thought even finished. We'll be back. They walked side by side toward their truck, parked beneath a flickering street lamp, boots echoing on the pavement. As they opened the doors, Steven paused and looked at Keanu. You ever wonder why we always end up in the middle of these things? Keanu shrugged. Maybe we just see what others ignore. And maybe we care enough not to walk away. The truck door slammed shut. The engine roared softly to life. From the restaurant window, Rena watched them go. Her arms were folded across her chest, apron still tied, a slight smile on her lips. Not of relief, of understanding. Inside her, something had shifted forever. Not because two famous men had defended her, but because she'd found her voice, and the town had listened. As the truck disappeared down the road, the town behind them settled into stillness again. But something had changed. Sometimes, change doesn't start with a loud voice or a raised fist. Sometimes it begins in the quietest of places. A worn-down booth, a whisper carried across a plate of food, and a look that asks, "Will you help?" That's all it took. Rena didn't plan to change anything that night. She wasn't trying to be a hero. She just reached her breaking point. The fear had soaked too deep, and when she looked at Keanu Reeves sitting in front of her, something told her he might actually listen. She didn't even say the full truth, just hinted, quietly. Her voice shook. Her eyes darted. But that moment cracked something open. And that was enough. Because courage doesn't always roar. More often it trembles, it hesitates. But it moves anyway. We often forget how many people live with invisible pressure pressing against their backs. The ones who serve coffee with forced smiles. The ones who duck their heads in meetings, hoping not to be noticed. The ones who laugh along with cruel jokes so they won't become the next target. They're not weak. They're surviving. But deep down, they're waiting for someone to say, "It's okay to speak." That night, Rena didn't just speak for herself. She unknowingly lit a fuse. What happened next wasn't magic. It wasn't Hollywood. It was what happens when decency meets timing. When someone with power chooses to protect, not exploit. When someone with fame chooses to listen, not dismiss. When someone standing in safety steps toward the storm instead of walking away. Keanu and Steven could have paid their check and left. They could have told themselves it wasn't their place. But instead, they stood still. They didn't shout. They didn't grandstand. They just stood with her. That kind of solidarity doesn't always need a stage. It just needs presence. The thing about silence is that it tricks you into believing it's neutral. But silence isn't neutral. It's a weight, and it always lands on someone. In that restaurant, for years, silence was protection. For the powerful. For the ones who spat slurs, slammed fists on tables, and made every marginalized person feel like an intruder in their own town. The staff learned to keep their heads down. The regulars grew used to averting their eyes. Even the walls seemed to hold their breath. But not that night. When Rena spoke, it was like air returned to the room. It wasn't just words. It was a challenge to everyone who had ever looked away. She didn't need a crowd. She didn't need applause. She just needed the truth to stop hiding. And the most extraordinary thing? That truth echoed. It reached the quiet ones in the room. The woman at the window who had once been turned away. The veteran who stopped coming because his biracial grandchildren were mocked by men at the counter. The teenager who thought staying silent was the only way to keep her job. One by one, they found their voice. Not in unison, but like candles passed hand to hand, each one lighting the next. That's how real change begins. When Blake stood frozen that night, looking toward the back corner where Dominic used to sit, the conflict in him was visible. He was the owner's son. He'd grown up believing peace meant keeping customers, even terrible ones, happy. But in that moment, he saw something else. He saw what his father's silence had bred. He saw the weight Rena had carried. And for the first time, he couldn't unsee it. Change doesn't always look like fire. Sometimes it looks like a man quietly taking down a sign that once said, "We reserve the right to refuse service," and replacing it with one that says, "This place serves everyone." Sometimes it looks like him standing at the front of the restaurant with a nod instead of avoidance. Sometimes it's in the way the staff starts to walk taller, how guests start to linger longer, how no one flinches when a mixed couple walks in. And sometimes it's just a look of recognition between people who once thought they were alone. When Keanu and Steven returned that afternoon, it wasn't about checking up or being seen. It was about honoring a moment that now lived in the wood of the floorboards, in the steadiness of Rena's hands as she poured coffee, and in the conversations happening at every booth. ones filled with laughter instead of tension. They didn't speak much. They didn't need to. The town had already started talking to itself. Steven leaned back and watched it unfold with quiet contentment. Keanu looked out at the street, the sidewalks now familiar, and smiled. Not because the battle was over, but because something had begun. A shift. The truth is, you don't always need to win the whole war. Sometimes, you just need to win one room. And Rena won that room with a whisper. Her journey isn't unique. Around the world, there are thousands of women like her, overlooked, underpaid, and underestimated. But what made this night unforgettable wasn't that she fought back with fists or shouted anyone down. It was that she dared to ask for help, even when she didn't believe anyone would give it. That vulnerability, so often mistaken for weakness, is where strength actually begins. We forget that every great movement began with someone saying, "This isn't right." Not in anger, but in truth. And truth has its own gravity. The community that once averted its gaze had to confront itself. And what happened next wasn't a revolution. It was redemption. The restaurant didn't become perfect, but it became better. The people didn't become saints, but they became awake. And when people are awake, they start choosing differently. Some chose to come back, some chose to leave, but all of them remembered. And in that remembering, Rena's quiet act became something none of them could ignore. Keanu's final words to her, "We don't walk away from people trying to do what's right," weren't just meant for her. They were meant for every person watching. Every viewer who's ever been in a room where something wrong was happening and didn't know if they should speak. Let this be your reminder. You don't need to be powerful to matter. You don't need to be famous to be heard. You just need to be willing to say, "Enough." The world doesn't change because of celebrities. It changes because of people like Rena. People like you. The ones who see something and decide not to look away. The ones who speak even when their voice trembles. The ones who stand alone if they have to, until someone joins them, because someone always will. Courage may begin in isolation, but it never ends there. It spreads. It lifts. It rewrites the room. Have you ever witnessed someone speak up when no one else dared? Tell us your incredible story in the comments. And if this moved you, share it with someone brave.